Hello, my name is Daniel. Sorry, let me just make sure. I'm sorry, you can hear me, right?
Yes,
You-
we can hear you.
okay, thank you. Hello, my name is Daniel Roman, and this is my emerging research presentation on the struggles and triumphs of the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen were among some of the most skilled pilots in American military history. Prior to the creation of the 99th Tuskegee Pursuit Squadron in 1941, African Americans were not permitted to serve as pilots in the American Army Air Corps. According to scholar Lewis Carlson, white Americans did not believe that African American men could successfully fly combat planes. Because of such attitudes, future Tuskegee Airmen such as Benjamin Davis felt they had to, quote, prove our worth to racist individuals and institutions who wanted them to fail. Fortunately for Davis, on January 16, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt and Secretary of the Army Henry Stimson permitted the creation of an all-black fighter group to be commissioned by the United States Army Air Corps. In March 1941, the 99th Pursuit Squadron was officially activated. By February of 1944, the 99th Pursuit Squadron had joined the 301st and 302nd Squadrons to form the 332nd Tuskegee Fighter Group. The 477th Tuskegee Bombardment Group was founded in 1943. The Tuskegee Airmen quickly developed a reputation as skillful pilots. They were capable of protecting American bombers flying over Germany and strafing enemy aircraft. My central research question is, how did these African American soldiers respond to institutional and societal racism in the United States Army during World War II and after returning home to the cities of Detroit and Columbus? For the purposes of this presentation, I am defining institutional racism as prejudice found within certain laws, policies, and organizations. In contrast, I interpret societal racism as originating from prejudicial beliefs and norms which have been accepted by large segments of the general population. The distinction between institutional and societal racism is important because it highlights how pervasive racism was throughout American society at this time. Understanding this demonstrates the resiliency that these four Tuskegee Airmen displayed. Jefferson, Young, Dryden, and Brown each strategically and effectively approached institutional and societal racism in the military and in American society after they returned home. Their effectiveness is demonstrated by the fact that institutional military policies were changed as a result of their efforts, as well as long held societal norms and values regarding race. These four Tuskegee Airmen responded differently to various forms of racism they encountered. For example, Harold Brown responded to racism at the Tuskegee airfield by surpassing his white officers' expectations. He disproved the stereotype that Black Americans could not become elite fighter pilots. In contrast, when he was confronted by racist individuals, Dryden organized his fellow Tuskegee Airmen, Charles Dryden organized his fellow Tuskegee Airmen to protest racism at Selfridge Air Base. The central argument of this presentation is that Alexander Jefferson, Coleman Young, Charles Dryden, and Harold Brown overcame institutional and societal racism through collective organizing and individual accommodation. Furthermore, I will argue that the motivations of these Tuskegee Airmen to combat racism was influenced more by their positions within their communities rather than their upbringing. Methodology. I will use a comparative analysis methodology in my presentation. Specifically, in this presentation, I discuss how Charles Dryden and Coleman Young were impacted by racism during World War II. However, it's important to note why I selected these airmen. Of the approximately 16 autobiographies written by the Tuskegee Airmen following World War II, I chose the memoirs of Brown, Jefferson, Young, and Dryden as they are well written and insightful. I also selected these memoirs as these airmen all trained at the Tuskegee Institute and resided in Detroit or Columbus following World War II. Charles Dryden and Coleman Young were affected by racism during their years of service. For example, in March of 1944, Dryden was wrongfully accused of insubordination and misconduct by General Frank Hunter at Walterboro Air Base. The military judge that reviewed Dryden's case determined he was guilty of insubordination and misconduct. Interestingly, the judge did not issue Dryden a dishonorable discharge. Instead, the court fined Dryden $330, prevented him from leaving the base for 3 months, and, quote, suspended him from promotion eligibility for 1 year. Although not mentioned by Dryden, it appears the court displayed racial biases against Black military personnel. During the Second World War, Black soldiers were less likely to receive adequate legal representation. It is important to note that Dryden did not want to create discord on the base. In response to institutional racism Dryden faced on a daily basis, he attempted to ensure that white officers such as General Frank Hunter and Colonel Boyd respected his authority as a Tuskegee lieutenant. Fortunately, on August 19, 1944, Dryden flew his P-47 Thunderbolt plane and taught new recruits of the 477th Tuskegee Bomber Group how to engage enemy aircraft. While these recruits never made it to Europe or Asia during World War II, many of these pilots would play crucial roles in America's bombing runs over North Korea during the Korean War. Without these pilots, it would have been difficult for America to maintain its air superiority during the war. Dryden also experienced instances of societal racism while flying as a combat pilot during World War II. For instance, in 1943, a white military police officer racially profiled Dryden at their Moroccan air base by singling him out from the rest of the soldiers. Additionally, many white soldiers at this base demonstrated prejudice against Dryden and the other Tuskegee Airmen. According to Dryden, the poison of bigotry had already been spread abroad by some GIs in the theater who displayed plantation attitudes, even as they fought to defeat the, quote, master race, Nazis, and their notions of racial superiority. This is an example of societal racism, as the white soldiers' attitudes were inspired by prejudicial American norms and values. These norms and values included shunning Black people in public spaces, regarding African Americans as violent by nature, and denying them basic human rights. In response to societal racism, similar to Brown, Dryden continued to improve as a combat pilot. In late 1943, Dryden successfully escorted medium-range bombers over the German stronghold of Castelvetrano in Sicily. Dryden and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen successfully bombed the stronghold and eliminated enemy Luftwaffe aircraft. While not stated by Dryden, the taking out of this base was vital in order for French, British, and American ships to land and occupy Sicily. This invasion was known as Operation Husky. Coleman Young experienced many instances of institutional racism as well, since he served as a Tuskegee Airman in World War II. For instance, in March 1945, Young and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen were charged with, quote, willful disobedience by the military at Freeman Airfield in Indiana. This was after General Hunter and Colonel Hartzell at Freeman Airfield had a poorly constructed officers' club built for the Tuskegee Airmen. In response, Young, along with the support from members of Squadron E of the 118th Administrative Unit, entered the White Officers Club. As a result, 101 Black officers of the 477 Bombardment Group, including Young, were arrested by military police. In response, Young worked with a Detroit cadet and future General Chappie James to write letters to news outlets such as the Pittsburgh Courier, informing them about discrimination on air bases. Young's efforts were effective as the military was pressured by the press to drop all charges against him. This instance of institutional racism is also significant because it highlights the separate but equal doctrine. During the 1940s, Black Americans were expected to reside in public spaces designated as, quote, equal but segregated. According to the 2022 National Archives article titled Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, the historical precedent that permitted segregation to exist was the 1896 Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson. This case allowed southern states such as Louisiana to segregate Black Americans to Black-only train cars. This case is relevant to my presentation because General Hunter and Colonel Selway justified their racist actions by operating under the framework of the separate but equal clause. Young also experienced instances of societal racism. For example, while in Indiana, Young was unable to visit, quote, most restaurants and stores because they did not serve people of color. As a result, Young stated, quote, "This effectively confined the Black officers to the base." Northern white businesses were legally permitted to sell products to Black individuals. However, due to their prejudices, white business owners chose to discriminate against African American consumers. In response, Young, with his fellow Tuskegee Airmen, decided to boycott these businesses. They boycotted them by refusing to shop in, quote, white men's places that were complacent in the segregation of African American consumers. It is imperative to examine why Dryden responded to institutional racism differently than Young did. Young chose to directly confront his racist white officers while Dryden did not. While his fellow Tuskegee Airmen supported Dryden, he did not have as many advocates as Young had. In addition, Dryden was focused on advancing his military career, which required him to be more forgiving of his white officers. In contrast, Young was not as interested in advancing within the Army Air Corps. Besides institutional racism, it is also crucial to analyze the differences between how Dryden and Young combated societal racism. As stated before, Dryden did not adopt a confrontationalist approach when addressing societal racism. This is because, unlike Young, Dryden implies that he did not have, quote, enough support from his fellow Tuskegee Airmen to hold his white officers accountable for their actions. Also, Dryden was in Europe when he was affected by societal racism, while Young was in the United States. This meant Young had more opportunities to influence the racist perspectives of white Americans. In addition, Dryden did not have the same opportunities as Young because he was a prisoner of war. As a POW, Dryden was not allowed to interact with German civilians. However, it is important to note how Americans and Germans interpreted racism during World War II. In America, Black Americans were marginalized due primarily to the color of their skin. Blackness in America has been historically associated with criminality and sedition. In Germany, discrimination against Black people was less common simply because there were fewer Blacks. When Black people in Germany were marginalized, it was done through the context of the Nazi ideology. While skin color was a factor, the Nazis primarily despised Black people since they were assumed to be from Africa.
Daniel, I'm sorry to jump in. If you could wrap up
I'm
soon.
almost done.
Okay,
Sorry.
great. Thank you.
My research is relevant because it will allow people to understand how Black servicemen continue to be affected by different forms of racism. Furthermore, my research is significant because it demonstrates how the Tuskegee Airmen's success during World War II provided future Black servicemen with new opportunities. These opportunities including serving as combat officers in mixed race flying units and fighting in future conflicts such as the Korean War. As a result, my fellow scholars will have the historical contextualization needed to understand how to fight racism within the military. I just want to say thank you to Dr. Simmons, Lehmann, and Asaka for supporting me during this entire process. I could not have done it without their support. In conclusion, by understanding how these airmen combated racism, we too can find new ways to fight for equality in America. Thank you. And here's my bibliography.